Hey everyone, today we're going to look at Azure. We looked at Azure yesterday. Today we're going to look at AWS, so the Amazon equivalent. So what's interesting about platform as a service offerings, similarly with container as a service, Kubernetes as a service, function as a service, each one of the clouds take a slightly different slant. Some of that has to do with how they got the technology, some of which it was acquired, some of which was developed in-house. Some of it has to do with their vision for how all of this should come together. So today's video, we'll talk about AWS's equivalents to yesterday's video, where we talked about Azure App Service, Kubernetes Service, and Container Service, or container instances. Today, we're going to talk about 3 services from 4 if you mentioned Lambda. We talked about function as a service late in yesterday's video. We'll talk about that now. Just to get it out of the way. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but function as a service, the ability to take code and run it in a serverless environment, essentially not dealing with containers or VMs certainly, or really anything else at the infrastructure as a service layer. AWS has its equivalent to Azure Functions called AWS Lambda. They were one of the very first to offer this kind of thing, particularly in a public cloud. It's a great service. But to get on topic, AWS has 3 services that are somewhat comparable to yesterday's conversation. We talked about App Service from Azure yesterday. Today we'll talk about Beanstalk. So Beanstalk is a way in AWS. It's the only one that we'll talk about today that doesn't have Elastic in front of it. So, actually, I think there was a time in which it was Elastic Beanstalk, but I think now it's eponymously known as Beanstalk. But AWS Beanstalk is the ability to take a workload, an app, frequently a web application, and run it. Now, you can run your application as a container, much like App Service you can in Azure. So again, Beanstalk provides sort of 2 paths similar to, in a way similar to Azure App Service, but AWS Beanstalk is the AWS equivalent. Not surprising based on its heritage. It gives a little bit of preference to the open source technologies and languages, but Azure does a phenomenal job in that spot too. Second is Elastic Container Service. Now, there's a lot of places where each one of these services are different. Again, we won't spend a lot of time on that today, but Elastic Container Service is pretty much, particularly in principle, the equivalent and somewhat identical service to Azure Kubernetes Service. Now, there's lots of differences, lots of nuances, some of which pertain to being a Microsoft technology, meaning, of course, AKS or Azure Kubernetes Service provides some Microsoft integrations that Elastic Container or Kubernetes Service doesn't try to provide. Elastic Container or Kubernetes Service historically actually gave you better control of the worker nodes, sort of the VMs that power the hosting of your containers. I don't know that that's necessarily true anymore, but Elastic Kubernetes Service is a great way to get Kubernetes as a service. Again, to pull back on our CAS with the K, platform service we discussed in the previous video. And lastly, AWS has something that Azure doesn't have. So this is where visions start to diverge a bit. We mentioned Azure Container Instances yesterday. AWS has a sort of equivalent, but a lot more robust Elastic Container Service. Elastic Container Service, interestingly, has lots of overlap with Kubernetes itself. So it provides you the opportunity to host workloads, complex workloads, in much the same way you could in Kubernetes, in Elastic Kubernetes Service. But ECS provides a little bit less of the heavy Kubernetes terminology and resourcing. There is less flexibility, but it sort of fits in terms of flexibility and purpose, fits between the single container deployment management of Azure container instances and the very complex, or at least reasonably complex, Kubernetes environment within both of those Kubernetes as a services at AKS and EKS. But Elastic Container Service is a very popular way to host containers in AWS. Is a service that provides you the ability to host and load balance and manage the lifecycle around containerized deployments, much like you do in Kubernetes, but just with a slightly simplified term set, and all or much of the management UI is delivered natively within the AWS console. So that's the enabling technology in AWS that supports app modernization, particularly around hosting and containerized workloads.